Hello again, I am Lucky and I am pursuing my integrated MBA in data science and artificial intelligence from IIT Mandi. So, continuing with this book, Critical Thinking by Alec Fisher. So, I was on first chapter, Critical Thinking, what it is and how it can be improved. So, continuing from the last video, question 1.8. In this case, two friends, Bertha and Cheryl, are watching an American TV program on the 1991 Gulf War. The presenter, who is American, comments on the pinpoint accuracy of the US weapons and says that the film shows heat seeking missiles going down the chimneys of buildings to blow them up, and ground based US Patriot missiles intercepting and blowing them up incoming Iraqi Scud missiles. Bertha and Cheryl watch and listen with fascination as how many people did during the Gulf War. Bertha remarks on how amazing it is that weapons can be so accurate and expresses her relief that America had them. Cheryl, who is majoring in media studies, is not quite so sure. She points out that the sequence showing the heat seeking missiles going down the chimneys was supplied by the US Air Force, since it was taken by the plane which fired it, and that we are not told how such missiles missed their target completely. She also points out that the sequence showing Patriot missiles exploding scuds in midair was hard for anyone but a military expert to interpret. Was the flash a Patriot hitting a scud or a Patriot exploding too soon? And then how many scuds were missed altogether? Only the military really knew, and perhaps even they didn't know at that time. But either way, the presenter clearly relied on the interpretation of the flashes given by military people, and they had a propaganda job to do. Bertha, who is studying computing and usually says she is not really interested in politics, is irritated by Cheryl's skepticism and does not really want to hear about it. However, Cheryl says she had studied similar news reports from other wars, which is why she has her doubts. Bertha says Cheryl's teachers are all liberals and communists. Cheryl says this is rubbish, that some of her teachers were very established figures, sometimes acting as government advisors, and that her course is one of the most respected in the US. Again, the question has three parts. First one is look at Davies' definition and decide to what extent Bertha and Cheryl display reflective thinking. Again, are they active and persistent? Second is referring to our list of skills, do Bertha and Cheryl identify and evaluate assumption, judge the acceptability, especially the credibility of claims, analyze, evaluate, and produce explanation, draw inference, produce arguments. The third question is would you say that Bertha or Cheryl display critical thinking skills? Give your reasons. So, according to me, as Cheryl is showing reflective thinking, she's thinking about what assumptions the speaker has made, and also she's doubting the credibility of the claims as she's using her own reasoning and reflective thinking to analyze this and drawing inference. And critical thinking skills are displayed by Cheryl because she's intervening the argument given by the presenter on the American TV program. So now comes a final definition of critical thinking. One last definition is worth reviewing. Michael Scriven has argued that critical thinking is an academic competency akin to reading and writing and is of similarly fundamental importance. He defines it thus: critical thinking is skilled and active interpretation and evaluation of observations and communication, information, and arguments. Critical thinking is skilled and active interpretation and evaluation of observations communication, information, and argumentation. Cool. It is worth unpacking Scriven's definition a little. He defines critical thinking as a skilled activity for reasons similar to those he mentioned above. He pointed out that thinking does not count as critically merely because it is intended to be, any more than thinking counts as specific simply because it aims to be scientific. To be critical, thinking has to meet certain standards of clarity, relevance, reasonableness, and so on, and one may be more or less skilled at this. He defines critical thinking as the active process, partly because it involves questioning, and partly because the role played by metacognition, thinking about your own abilities. He includes interpretation of text, film, speech, graphic, action, and even body language, because, like explanation, interpretation typically involves constructing and selecting the best of several alternatives, and it is a crucial preliminary to draw a conclusion about complex claims. He includes evaluation because this is the process of determining the merit, quality. Okay. Uh, Thinking about your own abilities. He includes interpretation because, like explanation, interpretation typically involves constructing and selecting the best of several alternatives, and is a crucial preliminary to draw conclusion about complex claims. He includes evaluation because this is a process of determining the merit, quality, worth, or value of something. And much critical thinking is concerned with evaluating the truth, probability, or reliability of claims. It is unusual to include explicit reference to observations in a definition of critical thinking, but as our goal, for example, Gulf, for example, showed what one sees or hears, for example, often requires interpretation and evaluation, and this may well require the use of critical thinking skills. Skewen takes the term information to refer to factual claims, and the term communications goes beyond information to include questions, commands, other linguistic utterances, signals, and so on. Finally, argumentation consists of language presenting reasons for conclusion. Perhaps the most striking feature of this definition is the way it recognizes that observations can be matter for critical thinking. This is the last extension of the notion of critical thinking. We shall draw to your attention. We have run through this survey of definitions to give you a sense of development of thinking in this area, to show that it is a changing idea but one which has a core which remains constant, and to show you what a rich idea it is. It should be instructive to contrast what you have read in the previous few pages with the initial definition you give yourself in the chapters which follow. We shall give you extensive practice in developing some of the basic skills which belong to the core of critical thinking, but we hope that you will see this work in the rich context we have just described. So, basically, the final definition of critical thinking is skilled active interpretation and evaluation of observation, communication, information, and argumentation. Now, dispositions and values of critical thinker. Dispositions and values of the critical thinker. It is clear that someone can have a skill which they choose not to use or not to use much. The example we gave earlier was of someone who can turn somersaults but who chooses not to. In the case of critical thinking, it is clear that someone who could have the relevant skills but might not bother or choose to use them in appropriate situation. For example, they might show they had the skill by raising the right credibility question in an examination, but they might not apply the skill in other work or in everyday situation. Indeed, many people who have worked in critical thinking tradition have thought there was something intrinsically wrong with such an attitude of good thinking. If we look back at Glazer's definition, we see that he actually includes an attitude of being disposed to consider problems thoughtfully as a part of his very definition of critical thinking. So in Glazer's definition, we see that he actually includes an attitude of being disposed to consider problems thoughtfully as part of his very definition of critical thinking. Glazer and others have argued that it makes no sense to have these skills or to develop them, and at the same time to fail to act on them whenever it is appropriate. They argue that if, for example, you are skilled at judging the credibility of evidence, you'll see that this produces more reasonable beliefs than if you are rather more gullible, and that you cannot fail to see that it is better. Then you will be led astray less often, and that this is to your advantage. Thus, they argue you cannot fail to see that this skill is worth using whenever significant questions of credibility arises. It is valuable, and it will pay you to someone put his whole knowledge of his life into this book. So each and every word of this book has a meaning. Every page has some sense. Multiple people have put thousands of their hours in this book. It is something worthwhile. I have to be more focused while reading this. It is valuable, and it will pay you to adopt the habit of using it, to be disposed to use it. It is hard to understand someone who develops these thinking skills and then does not bother to use them quite generally. They are undoubtedly valuable skills, and if you can get yourself into the habit of using them, they can greatly increase your understanding of many contexts. So, critical thinking will deeply influence and increase my ability to understanding different contexts greatly. The moral is, do not just use them in the critical thinking class, but apply them in other studies too, or in everyday life. You may be surprised to discover how useful they are. To conclude these remarks on a personal note, I thought I taught critical thinking in a university context for some years, and as we proceed through this course, many of my students came to me and said how useful they found these skills in their other courses. Then they nearly always added, "These skills are so useful, I cannot understand why we were not taught them at school." There is no doubt that these skills are valuable, and they'll help you in many ways if you get into a habit of using them whenever it is appropriate. So, do not just acquire the skills but value them and use them. In short, become a critical thinker. Here is question 1.9. Which thinking skills, if any, should be applied to the following situation? Getting information from the internet, finding a telephone number in a telephone directory, deciding whether to accept a job offer, following a recipe to make a cake. So I think first and third, that is getting information from internet and deciding whether to accept a job offer, these two exercises or tasks need critical thinking or thinking skills. So next topic is critico creative thinking. As we said earlier, critical thinking is sometimes referred to as critico creative thinking. There are two related reasons for this. The first is the term critical thinking is sometimes thought to sound rather negative, as thought one's only interest is in adversely criticizing other people's argument and ideas. This would be a serious mistake, since as this is the second reason to be good at evaluating arguments and ideas. One often has to be very imaginative and creative about other possibilities, alternative consideration, different options, and so on. To be a good judge of issues, it is not enough to see faults in what other people say. You need to base your judgment on the best arguments you can devise in the time available, and this often requires you to think of relevant considerations other than those presented. Look at issues from different point of views. Imagine alternative scenarios and perhaps find other relevant information. In short, you will need to be quite creative. I would love to be. For both these reasons, some writers have wanted to speak of critical creative thinking to emphasize the positive imaginative aspect of critical thinking. Unfortunately, the result is a rather unwidely expression which has not caught on. So, we shall use the term critical thinking, which is now so widely used, whilst understanding it in this positive imaginative sense. Thus, we shall use it in the same sense that one speaks. For example, of a theater critic as someone whose comments and judgments may be either positive or negative. In short, critical thinking is kind of evaluative thinking, which involves both criticism and creative thinking, and which is particularly concerned with the quality of reasoning or argument which is being presented and in support of a belief or a course of action. So it is particularly concerned with the quality of reasoning or argument. So basically, the quality of reasoning and argument which is presented in support of a belief or course of action. So, final part for this chapter summary of this introduction. The critical thinking tradition is a long one and is still developing. However, it is not too difficult to summarize the ideas contained in the tradition, which we have just explained. It is clear that critical thinking is contrasted with unreflective thinking, the kind of thinking which occurs when someone jumps to a conclusion or accepts some evidence, claim, or decision at face value without really thinking of it. It is a skillful activity which may be done more or less well, and good critical thinking will meet various intellectual standards like those of clarity, relevance. Okay, so and good critical thinking will meet various intellectual standards like those of clarity, relevance, adequacy, coherence, and so on. Critical thinking clearly requires the interpretation and evaluation of observations. Critical thinking, okay, like those of clarity, relevance, adequacy, and coherence. Critical thinking clearly requires the interpretation and evaluation of observations, communication, and other source of informations. It is the interpretation and evaluation of uh, sources of information, observation, and communication. It also requires skill in thinking about assumptions, in taking pertinent questions, in drawing out implication, that is to say, in reasoning and arguing issues throughout. That is to say, in reasoning and arguing issues through. Furthermore, the critical thinker believes that there are many situations in which the best way to decide what to believe or do is to employ this kind of reasoned and reflective thinking. Reasoning The critical thinker believes that there are many situations in which the best way to decide what to believe or do is to employ this kind of reasoned and reflective thinking, and thus tends to use these methods whenever they are appropriate. Does this attitude imply that there is just one correct way to think about any given problem? No, but it does imply that most of us could do it better than we do, that is, more skillfully, reasonably, rationally, if we are asked the right questions. This tradition is all about improving our own thinking by consideration how we think in various contexts now, seeing a better model and trying to move our own practice towards the better model. It does not imply that there is just one correct way of thinking, which we should try to emulate, but there are better ways of thinking than we often exhibit, and that our poor thinking can be at least partially remedied by suitable practices. What follows in this book are the explanation and exercises which aim to do this precisely. So we are basically going to have better ways of thinking than we often exhibit, and that our poor thinking can be at least partially remedied by suitable practices. Okay, so this was the first chapter, critical thinking. What is it and how it can be improved? So that was all for today. Tomorrow we have holy celebration in our campus, and there are multiple arrangements done by the institute. I'll enjoy it. That was all for today. Good night. Jai Hind.